It was supposed to be a night of celebrations, music, drinks and laughter under the neon lights. But by the end of the night, numerous people would be clutching at their faces, screaming in agony as acid dropped from their skin. And the man responsible, he was hiding there in plain sight. And his text messages would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty and this was planned. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. On that Monday night, 21-year-old Sophie Hall had been getting ready for a night of celebrations. Sophie had travelled that night 3 hours from Poole to East London to celebrate her friend's birthday. They'd picked Mangle E8, a really busy nightclub in Dalston. That was going to be their night out, this place that's known for its vibrant atmosphere, packed dance floor and DJ sets that keep the energy high until the early hours. Sophie was feeling good. She had this all-black outfit on and she'd styled her hair down. She put the last little dab of lip gloss on her lips and then she got ready to leave and go out to the club. The night was alive at Mangle E8. There was this buzzing atmosphere. This nightclub in East London had neon lights that flickered against these brick walls. There were these bass-heavy beats that kind of rippled through the air. And the crowd was a mix of carefree strangers and also these tight-knit groups that would come often, or maybe they'd just be in town for a celebration, just like Sophie was. That night was supposed to be for drinks and laughter and just having a nice dance, where the worst thing that you'd be worrying about was how to get your next cocktail from the bar because it was so busy. Sophie and her friends found their spot, they grabbed some drinks and they just settled into the night. Everything felt normal. There was no warning, no strange vibe or kind of ominous foreshadowing. No one knew what was about to happen. No one knew how this night was going to end. And at one point, Sophie moved towards the dance floor. The lights were dim and the music was pulsing and there were a lot of people around and it seemed like everyone was having a good time. But in that sea of people, there was a man called Arthur Collins, and in his hand, he had a bottle. Now, no one knew at the time what was in that bottle, but what was happening on the dance floor was that he was having an argument. This kind of argument broke out with him and another couple of men. It didn't really seem like a big deal at first. But then the shouting got louder and louder, and before Sophie could really process what was happening, Sophie felt something hit her face. Now at first she thought maybe someone had spilled a drink or even thrown a drink, some splash of something had gone on her, something sticky. But then the burning started. Not just burning, it was searing. It was like a fire spreading all across her skin. She felt on her face and realised in horror that whatever had hit her was not a drink, it was acid. The pain was instant and indescribable. Sophie screamed, stumbling around her as people started to panic, and she kind of clutched at her face, trying to make sense of what was happening. That first scream ripped through the music, this high-pitched, piercing noise, and then there was another and another. Within seconds, it had gone from this kind of carefree energy to absolute chaos. Other people were now clutching their faces, stumbling blindly, their skin bubbling and burning. And all the while, the air was filled with this kind of stench of chemicals and people desperately trying to escape. And then someone yelled, quote, "Acid, someone's throwing acid." People were running now, shoving past each other, just trying to get out of the way. Some were yelling for help, others were just kind of stood there frozen in shock. Sophie, as we know, had been directly hit by the acid as it had been thrown or splashed through the crowd. And people had seen this happen, so strangers had rushed over to try and help her. Her friends were also there trying to help her, trying to kind of clean off the chemical with any kind of water that they could find. But by this point, it was too late. The acid had already started to do extensive damage. Emergency services were called to the scene immediately. Paramedics and police arrived and they found people standing outside of the club. They were crying in pain, their clothes and their skin visibly damaged. A number of the victims were taken to a local burns unit at the local hospital and they underwent emergency treatment. Sophie was rushed to the hospital and she had her neck, her face, her chest, they'd all been burnt by the acid, and so doctors got to work on her immediately. They treated her for those severe burns and she went under multiple procedures over the next few weeks and months. She had to have painful skin grafts to try and repair the damage. Her left eye had been partially blinded and she now had these permanent scars on her face. The recovery process that would follow was going to be physically excruciating. And burns like that don't stop causing damage after the initial contact. They can continue to penetrate deep into the different layers of tissue. So you need ongoing treatment. You need to make sure you don't get an infection. You need to try and minimize scarring. All of these things would take months. Sophie endured these months of medical care, dressing changes, physical therapy, and just various types of treatments to try and reduce inflammation and kind of start the healing process. Sophie would later describe feeling like her whole identity had been taken from her. Every time she looked in the mirror, she would see these scars on her face, and they were a constant reminder of that night. She couldn't get away from it. And on top of this, she'd obviously suffered an unimaginable level of emotional trauma and PTSD from the attack. Meanwhile, the police launched a full-scale investigation into the attack. The acid attack had left 22 people injured. But what was tricky was that this had happened at night in a club. It was very chaotic and it was messy. People had been drinking, eyewitness accounts were contradicting. This wasn't going to be an easy investigation. But the trouble that the police thought they were going to have because of the lack of corroborating eyewitness accounts didn't actually hinder their investigation for too long. We know with these kinds of crimes, with any kind of crime like this, it is so important to catch the perpetrator early on as possible. The longer it takes, sometimes that means the less chance of ever finding who did it. But in this case, they managed to get some really clear CCTV footage from inside the club at the time. This was focused directly on the incident and it gave a really clear image of what had happened and who the perpetrator was. It wasn't long before 25-year-old Arthur Collins was identified as the attacker. Arthur had grown up in Broxbourne, Hertfordshire, in what seemed like a typical suburban environment. He was born in 1992. Now, I don't know why, but I think someone who can do something like this is going to be really far away from me in terms of, I don't know, age, location, things like that. But this man being just a couple of years older than me, and the fact he was found in Northamptonshire, which is where I'm from originally, you probably get a similar icky, kind of just not nice feeling when a case connects to you in this way, when it's the perpetrator. He was just a quote-unquote normal person, and he's partying in a club with hundreds of other people who just kind of pass him on that evening, normal people just like you and me. But he was not normal by any means. In fact, he was incredibly calculated actually, and generally, Arthur came from this relatively privileged background, this upbringing that from the outside, it seemed like he had a really comfortable life. He dressed well. From the CCTV of the club, you might not think so, but that is how it's reported. I'll show you that later. But generally, he's described like a kind of put together guy in the press. This is what he's described as. He had a really big social circle. He got on with people really well. He was known as being charming and confident. And this helped him to attract friends and girlfriends over time. Over his teens and his early 20s, he had a lot of them. He was just generally really well liked. But those people who were close to him would later describe him as someone who could be controlling. He could be very volatile, and particularly in his personal relationships, this really came to the forefront. On the night of the attack, the club was packed with over 600 people, and Arthur had gone into this crowd of people and he brought that liquid in with him that night. The liquid was later found to be a highly concentrated sulfuric acid. It was around 1 a.m. that some kind of altercation or argument broke out between Arthur and a group of other men. This escalated quickly and things were just getting more and more heated. At one point, Arthur decided to pull that bottle of acid out, and as you will be able to see in the CCTV footage, he throws it ahead of him and onto the men he's arguing with. But of course, this is a liquid. There's no way to control the specific direction it's travelling in. Not that I think Arthur cared at all. But either way, the acid splashed on the men for sure, but it also splashed beyond them. And because the club was really busy, it was packed, the acid hit a number of bystanders who just happened to be nearby. Witnesses described chaos following the attack. Screams were heard as victims started to realise that they had been burned and that the acid was actually causing their skin to bubble and start to peel off. Some of the victims didn't even realise they'd been hit until they started to feel these kind of burning sensations moments later. The acid, when it made contact with your eyes, it would cause immediate burning and partial blindness in some of the victims. The CCTV footage shows him throwing that acid into the crowd not once but twice. In total, with those 22 people that were injured during the attack, the injuries really varied in severity. There were the two men who were the primary targets, and they both suffered severe facial and body burns. And there were, of course, a number of bystanders who suffered, including Sophie and her friend Lauren, who she'd gone out with that night. Many other people were hit by acid, burning their faces, their arms, their necks, their chests, and it left many of them with deep scars. Some victims were hit in the eye or eyes, and this caused partial or permanent blindness. And of course, not to mention the psychological toll was immense, with many of the victims later reporting symptoms of PTSD and anxiety. Now, meanwhile, the investigation was continuing. Police had identified Arthur publicly as a suspect, and an urgent appeal was launched for his capture. By this time, he'd gone on the run and into hiding. And the media, of course, was particularly interested in this case. It was captivating because Arthur, at the time, was dating a TV personality. Her name is Fern McCann. She's on The Only Way is Essex, or was on The Only Way is Essex. She's been on I'm a Celebrity in the Jungle. And at this time, it was a highly publicised case. And I think that really brought it to the forefront of people's knowledge. Arthur had gone into hiding, and he was in hiding for several days. He managed to somehow swerve law enforcement, and the media had, during this time, had kind of plastered his face everywhere, so he definitely couldn't leave wherever he was hiding. Fern McCann put out a public statement at this time urging him to come forward, saying that she didn't know where he was. She didn't actually know anything about any of his kind of criminal connections. It was clear to everyone involved in the investigation that this hadn't been a spur of the moment thing. This had been a premeditated attack. Arthur had smuggled that plastic bottle in with the sulfuric acid inside, knowing the damage that it might cause. Sulfuric acid is one of the most corrosive acids he could have used. He knew that it would burn through skin and fabric after initial contact. And forensic investigators did manage to conclude that this was bought with the intent of deliberately causing harm. And they knew this because after Arthur had gone into hiding, the police raided his house. Inside, investigators found partially burned clothing, they found it stained with acid, and they also found more bottles of the acid. The scary thing is, they didn't know why he had all of these bottles. If he'd only ever intended to hurt these two men who he was having this argument with, then why would he need so much of the substance? What his plan for those was just isn't known. Now, after the attack, as we know, Arthur had gone into hiding. He'd actually managed to evade the police for a number of days. And during this time, people were worried. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know what his mental state was. They didn't know what he was going to do next. If he was capable of injuring 22 people at a nightclub, there was no telling what was next for him. Thankfully, police did manage to track him down. They raided a property in Northamptonshire and found him hiding out there. Now, it's believed that this was a kind of temporary hideout. We don't know what his plan was going to be in the long term, just that he was staying there while things died down a little bit. Thankfully, though, police found him before he managed to get away and arrested him and brought him into custody. Investigators also managed to get access to Arthur's phone, and they managed to retrieve these text messages where he casually discussed carrying out an acid attack. This outright suggested premeditation. And as a further part of their investigation, they looked into Arthur's background, and while he didn't actually have any kind of official, formal criminal record, there were a number of reports that came out during the investigation itself that showed he had a troubling pattern of aggression, as well as links to criminal activity. His friends would later describe Arthur as having a really quick temper and a tendency to be the escalator of arguments. And a number of Arthur's previous girlfriends came forward and described him as controlling and manipulative. These accounts painted a picture of someone who really tended to disregard any kind of boundaries and generally would use his intimidation to assert dominance. One ex-girlfriend claimed that he had a pattern of gaslighting and manipulating her, and he'd use his charm to downplay his aggressive actions as well. One described feeling, quote, intimidated by him, saying that when they would have an argument, his temper would escalate quickly. She never knew where it was going to go, what was going to happen. Those who knew him described Arthur as a person who really thrived off of attention, and he viewed confrontation in general as a way to really assert his power. It was confusing for other people who knew him because he kind of showed this different side to himself. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was a bit of a socialite. He was always at nightclubs. He really met a lot of people who were influencers or reality TV stars, including his girlfriend Fern McCann. Their relationship had began in 2016 and it quickly became real tabloid fodder. It appears that fans saw them as this really glamorous pair. He really gave off this kind of completely other air of who he actually was. He presented himself as a really attentive boyfriend, but Arthur's darker traits came to the surface eventually. His and Fern's relationship was reported as being rocky and there were constant arguments, there was tension. At the time of the acid attack, actually, Fern was pregnant with Arthur's child. And at first, before all of this evidence came out, it seems that Fern couldn't really believe that Arthur was involved in this. He presented someone completely different to her, so she didn't understand how this could have happened. Eventually, of course, it was very clear that he was involved and she distanced herself from him and said that now she only has contact with him to co-parent their child together. Although I say co-parent, he is in prison. Spoiler alert. So how much co-parenting is going on? I don't know. After Arthur was tracked down, taken into police custody, he was interviewed about the acid attack. But Arthur claimed he had no idea that this substance that he had been carrying was acid at all. He thought it was a harmless cleaning solution. Why he would bottle up this, quote, harmless cleaning solution and then go on to throw it onto people he was having an argument with makes no sense. If he thought it was harmless, what's he trying to do? Was he trying to clean them or something? It makes no sense. It doesn't really matter what he said though. The evidence told a very different story. It told the truth. And when the case went to trial, everyone will finally know what that truth was. In the weeks since the attack, the media had already painted this really chilling picture of the actions leading up to it. The prosecution began by talking about the timeline of the attack. They walked the jury through his actions, through him walking into the club with a single malicious intent, which was to harm. He wouldn't have brought the acid in if he didn't mean to harm. Forensic experts were brought in to confirm what everyone knew, what everyone had feared, that this was sulfuric acid. It was one of the most dangerous substances and it would cause irreversible damage when it came into contact with skin. On top of this, Sophie Hall and other people who had been in the path of the spray, they were proof of just how dangerous it was. The most damning evidence, though, was actually that series of text messages that had been sent. Arthur sent them before the attack. His tone was very casual. He actually messaged about getting the acid, and it was just like it was his shopping list. It wasn't a big deal to him. There's something really unsettling about the familiarity of him with this weapon, I guess. And remember when I said that Arthur claimed to not know that that substance was corrosive, it was harmful? Those text messages showed the opposite of that. They were hard to ignore. They showed premeditation. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so each of the victims were called to testify. And Sophie was there, and her scars were on her face. They were visible. She spoke about how she would look in the mirror and just constantly be reminded of that damage, whilst others would take the stand and they would testify that they'd lost their vision, they'd lost their confidence, their sense of safety. Some spoke about how that trauma would never go away. Their lives have forever been altered by this one man's act of violence. Through it all, Arthur just kind of sat there with this kind of unsettling expression on his face. He was barely reacting to these painful accounts of what he'd done to them. His face showed no signs of remorse. The victims were haunted by their injuries, but Arthur seemed completely detached, much more concerned with his own defence rather than the lives he'd ruined, those people right in front of him. Arthur's background and his previous behaviours were brought up during the trial, and the court actually heard that in 2013 he had accepted a caution after the mother of his ex-girlfriend complained to police after he had called her a and threatened her with acid. He'd already threatened someone with acid before the incident, and now he's trying to say that he didn't even know it was a harmful substance. I guess the defence really didn't have much to work with this guy, but that is literally the best they could come up with, and obviously the jury did not buy it. The jury deliberated for just a short time, and obviously the evidence was overwhelming, especially that testimony from the victims. Arthur had made this choice, this violent, premeditated choice, and now he was going to face the consequences. In December 2017, the verdict was reached. Guilty on multiple accounts of grievous bodily harm with intent and additional charges of actual bodily harm. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison with an additional 5 years as extended licence. I think the scariest thing for me in this case is how Arthur presented himself. He really made people believe that he was this friendly, charming guy. He had this polished exterior that got him to know a lot of people. And behind that lay this really troubled personality marked by arrogance, absolute entitlement, and this tendency of violence. Even his friends, so people who are supposed to be close to him, supposed to have his back, they said that he enjoyed being centre of attention and how he would kind of often act like he was untouchable. The nightclub acid attack is a reminder of how a single moment of violence can really ripple outwards, affecting dozens of lives. Arthur Collins turned a nightclub into a scene of horror, driven by ego and a reckless disregard for human life. His actions sparked this kind of national outrage. I'm sure, of course, because he was dating someone who's famous, but also because of this rising trend of acid attacks in the UK. Even years later, the scars, both emotional and physical, of course remained for the victims. And to be honest, I don't think London, especially East London, Dalston, will ever forget what happened that night. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Red Rum. This week, I have to talk about Severance. I don't know if anyone else is watching it. I think it's actually been out a couple of years. It's on Apple TV. It's basically about, it's like this science fiction-y kind of thrillery program. It stars Adam Scott as this person who works at this corporate company that has this severance program. Basically, you can separate your work self from your non-work self. So you're aware of yourself in both realities, but you don't remember what happens during the present time. I'm really not explaining this well. Basically, your memories are split into two. So your work self is in the building, the corporate building, pretty much 24/7, and your non-work self is obviously not at work, just at home doing your everyday stuff. In this world, this severance thing is highly controversial, and the first season is all about how these mysteries from his work life kind of start to infiltrate his outside life. It's really weird. It's so brilliantly made. I have no idea where it's about to go. I think halfway through season 1, so I've still got a little way to go. Season 2 comes out next year, so I'm hoping it just continues on up and continues to be as good as it's been so far. I've only ever seen Adam Scott in comedic roles like Step Brothers, but this is a much more serious role. There are some elements of like dark comedy in it, but it's definitely a more serious role, and he's exceptional. Oh, and it's directed by Ben Stiller. Who knew? Well, actually, I didn't know, but I googled him as a director after I'd watched it, or when I watched an episode, and he's directed loads, like literally since 1994, since before I was born. So he is definitely a director, very established one, but he directs this and he's done a phenomenal job. I'm definitely going to go and watch some of his other things that he's directed. Anyway, what word vomit. Other than that, I will see you in a couple of days for the next episode of Red Rum. Bye.